Helo bawb. O, na ni. Croeso mawr iawn i chi i Llyfrgell Genedlaethol Cymru a'r noson Calan Gaea. Very, very warm welcome to you all to the National Library of Wales on Halloween. And we've got a treat in store tonight, yeah. So my name is Rodri ap Dyfrig. I'm the head of communication here at the library, and it's my privilege to introduce the evening tonight. We're of course here for Halloween and to hear about some witches. And as somebody from Dolgellau, I've heard lots of tales about drowning of witches off the Bont Fawr in Dolgellau, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about these tales and about how this has been woven into the novel. Before we get to that, today is also notable for one other thing which I really need to shout about. Aberystwyth Ceredigion has just been awarded denotation by UNESCO as an international city of literature. Yes. And that's the first chance I've had to actually celebrate it today, because I've been working on the press releases and everything, and it's been a nightmare. But it's, this is probably, as we were talking earlier, the first actual official event to be with the badge of Aberystwyth City of Literature. So, yeah, a little bit of Aberystwyth history happening here tonight. It's so exciting, and what it does mean is that we're going to have this badge, this recognition for 4 years, which will allow us to kind of develop more of our literary culture, spread it around the world, hold more events, do all sorts of things, hopefully get more funding in as well to carry out the activities. And it's such an important thing, and I think, Aberystwyth and Ceredigion thoroughly deserves it, so that's great. And we will be holding sort of stakeholder events, and an event to kind of welcome people to learn more about it and get involved around about December time. So keep an eye out on the website for that and register your email on there for more information. So, on to this evening. So we have two people here today to talk about the novel Witch. So, Mari Ellis Dunning is a poet, novelist and lecturer, and Witch is her debut novel. Her debut poetry collection, Salacia, was shortlisted for Wales Book of the Year 2019, and her second collection, Pearl and Bone, was chosen as Wales Arts Review's #1 Poetry Choice 2022. Mari teaches at Aberystwyth University, where she delivers courses on feminist writing. She's also the founder of Pay for Poets, a free resource to help writers earn a living through their work. And asking the questions tonight will be Dr Emma Butler-Way. She's a lecturer in Aberystwyth University's Integrated Foundation Year. She holds a PhD in English literature, and her research focused on British sensation fiction in the 1860s, with a specific focus on how it interacts with contemporary fashion narratives. And her current research is broadly focused on representations of the corset, and by extension the female body, in Victorian and neo-Victorian fiction. I was just thinking about that. Have you seen the exhibition upstairs, Power of the Portrait? Lots of depictions and thoughts and sort of discussion about women and women's bodies and who has the power of the gaze and that kind of thing. So take a look. Yeah, it'll be great. Maybe come and do a workshop with us as well. There we go. This is how we do it, flashing out ideas as we go. Give them a very warm welcome, and I won't talk anymore. Thank you very much, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. Diolch yn fawr.
Congratulations on the novel.
Thank you.
The position of women within patriarchy has been sort of a running theme of your work to date, whether that's in essays or poetry, and your recent pamphlet, Crocodile, was particularly prescient and biting, if you will, on that front. Now, I'll come back to the witchcraft side of things in just a moment, but to get us started, what was it that made you decide to take these explorations in a more sort of prose fiction avenue than sort of poetry?
I think, I've written a lot of poetry that looks at women's stories, and you can do a lot in a poem. You can do a lot in a very short space of time, or a short word count with a poem. But the witch trials, I think, just felt like something bigger. And I think in terms of fostering empathy and compassion for real people, you know, there's, yes, you can do it in a poem, but I think everybody knows about the witch trials, and we know the stats, and, you know, we know what happened, and we know it's awful, but it kind of only goes so far. So kind of capturing the story of just one woman across a novel-length piece felt like it was going to do it more justice than speaking about it in a poem, which would kind of be a snapshot moment. I really wanted Dolly's story to kind of linger in the mind and to really be able to see how things unfolded over a long period of time, rather than just kind of a short piece.
Yeah. Thank you. So witchcraft narratives, you know, saying, you know, need that sort of longer time with them, but, you know, traditionally, you know, they seem to crop up in response to various political goings-on. So Arthur Miller's The Crucible, for example, famously a response to the McCarthy witch hunts in the mid-20th century. Over the past few years, witchcraft narratives have had something of a boom, notably from like the mid-2010s onwards, though these have focused on the more sort of well-known sort of English and Scottish witch trials. So I guess this is a sort of two-pronged question, really. So first, why do you think we've seen this uptick in witchcraft narratives over the last 10 years? You know, was there perhaps something political that occurred? And
Maybe.
second, within this environment, was there anything in particular that attracted you to writing about how so-called witches were treated in Wales, or that even sort of prompted you to do so?
Yeah, so I think, as you say, it kind of focuses on a political... There's a really good quote by, I think it's Diana Wallace, where she talks about how historical fiction has often been used by women as a political tool.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really powerful in being able to retell stories through literature. And so, in terms of... I think the reason there's been a resurgence in witchcraft narratives is it's all kind of tied into female power. And I think there's an element of women kind of finding their voices and finding a way to speak out against this kind of patriarchal system that we've all been living in for centuries, while also being aware that that is still an issue. So I think it's women wanting to retell these stories and reclaim these stories and re-find the voices and share the stories of women who've women in the past who didn't get to tell their own stories. There's also, I think, an element of, you know, history was written by men. It wasn't recorded by women. It was recorded by men. And so it's always biased, and there's always a slant on it, and it feels prescient that we kind of retell those stories. And I think in light of, you know, the Me Too movement and women kind of finding their power and finding their voices and reclaiming something, I think that's the reason that, number one, women are wanting to tell these stories, and number two, that consumers want to read them. In terms of it being focused on Wales, it wasn't my original intention. My original intention was that I wanted to tell a story about the witch trials, and I wanted to look at how how kind of gendered they were and how misogynistic they were. And I came to a talk here in this very room 6 years ago. By Richard Suggett, who was working at the time for the Royal Commission. And he gave a really interesting talk about the witch trials in Wales specifically. And he talked a lot about Gwen Ellis, who I already knew her story and I'd already published poems about her, but hearing Richard talk about her was really fascinating. And, you know, he's delved into the archives. He's really kind of combed through everything. So he gave this really fascinating talk, and I just felt like she needs to go in the book. And that's kind of where it came from. So the character in the book, who is the kind of the soothsayer witch figure, Sara Gwen, is very much influenced by Gwen Ellis. A little nod to her in the name as well, which sometimes confuses things, and maybe I shouldn't have done it because I accidentally crossed them over. But it was based on that, and then the fact that the witch trials in Wales were so different to everywhere else. We only had 5 sentences of death in Wales for witchcraft, so it just felt like there was something really interesting going on in Wales that wasn't going on anywhere else. So I wanted to kind of capture that as well.
Yeah, and they're not really spoken about at all, because when we think about the witch trials, it's, you know, Scotland had, you know, some of the highest death rates in Europe, and then like Pendle and everything.
Yeah, they're much more famous, much more well known. Wales only saw the 5 5 sentences of death for various reasons. But there's still an element, people in Wales were still scared of witches. They still believed in them. It's just that it never really made it high enough to, to the courts to actually be seen through. And so, fascinating stories when you look at them.
Yeah, definitely. Now, Witch is set in the 16th century, sort of towards the end of it. But as you were saying sort of earlier, there are so many narrative threads and themes that remain quite sort of discouragingly relevant today. Without giving too much away, what Dolly and Sara experience isn't really a million miles away from what many women's experiences today, particularly in terms of, women's place in society and the way that patriarchal society treats women of a certain age. You've got a line towards the middle where one of the male characters says, "These people, these women, they don't want to help us. Why would they? They mean us harm." And that whole scene is quite frightening, actually, in the way that that character is leaning on that approach. But if we dip our toes into the archival research that you did for this, because I know you did quite a lot, what sort of things came up on that front? Was there anything in the archives that surprised you at all in terms of the representation of women and all that sort of stuff?
I have so many thoughts.
Share them.
I think something that it didn't necessarily surprise me. It reaffirmed and I'm trying to think of the right word. Astounded me, maybe, or enraged me. That's a better word. How tied up in the female body the witch trials were, and how much they were centred on fear of the feminine body and the female body and the power that women hold, and how they effectively felt like a means of just suppressing women. And that comes through in the Malleus Maleficarum, which is one of the earliest witchcraft treatises, it kind of became a foundational text for witch trials. It's so misogynistic. It's all about how women are just innately, inherently evil, and their bodies are sordid and wrong, and it doesn't matter if they're kind of coming of age and finding their sexual power, or if they're menopausal. There's this great fear of older women because older women know what they're doing, and they care less, and there's this fear of them kind of corrupting younger women, and there's this whole thing in the Malleus about older women corrupting young virgins, and that was really reaffirmed in the Welsh archives as well, where there's stories about women who the familiar spirits don't get mentioned very often in Wales, but there are some records, and there's talk of women feeding their familiars through their own bodies. It's like some kind of perverse parody of breastfeeding, and lots about corruption of young women. And I need to tell you one thing. This enraged me. There's a case where a woman was accused of witchcraft by a young woman's father because she'd apparently poisoned her and corrupted her to encourage her to run away with this man. And in Richard Suggett's book about it, in the foreword written not by Richard Suggett, it says that this woman did the classic crying rape, and I know. So all very tied up in kind of fear of the female body, I think, and that is what stood out to me most. Does that answer the question, Honno? Have I just rambled?
No, that answers it. Got another one for you. And this is on the blurb, so it's not a massive giveaway in terms of plot, but Dolly, your protagonist, she's almost sort of painfully naive and ignorant of the wider world. But interestingly, she's also very aware and quite resentful of that, I think. But it's a very different kind of ignorance that led to sort of the prosecution and persecution of these so-called witches, which other characters have in spades in your novel. So what was it, if you think about sort of the writing side of things for a moment, what was it like writing that sort of character, or sort of characters even if we bring the others in, and developing Dolly's quite painful journey towards knowledge when, you're writing it with that knowledge already?
Yeah, I think, Dolly starts out as she's quite reliant on her husband. She doesn't know much of the world. And when she has a child and becomes a mother, I think she has kind of rediscovered or discovers a power within her. And and realises that her husband isn't right about everything. And it was important for me to kind of take the readers on that journey. So, I could have gone in from the beginning with Dolly kind of aware that the things people were saying was obscene, but I didn't want to do that because I wanted there to be an element of maybe doubt from her, or where actually there could be harmful magic, and for that to kind of progress with the reader through Dolly's eyes. And obviously it's written in first person narrative voice, so we're in Dolly's mind. In terms of the other characters who feel a certain way about women and witches, I think writing that was not overly difficult because it's very easy to see the world that we live in and to draw on that. And to just kind of, do they really believe it? Are they just using women as a political tool? Howell, Dolly's husband, is maybe he believes, I think he does believe in witches, but I think he's also trying to kind of climb a social ladder. It wasn't, sadly, not as difficult as you would hope to kind of picture those characters and to feel that they were real.
The sort of interesting thing with Howell's development, actually, that I was particularly struck by reading it, is the way that his belief seems to get more and more intense as the book goes on. And as this idea of, saying sort of climbing the social ladder, as that becomes a much more sort of tangible thing for him, his, concurrently that sort of belief, those sort of threats that it holds it's very interesting. Very prescient. Well, there were times I was like, am I reading a book set in the 16th century?
And that's the trouble, isn't it?
Now, as we know, you are a poet. And there are some beautifully poetic turns of phrase throughout the novel. So how much did you, being a poet, impact on your decision to have Dolly writing poetry? There's some really nice moments between Dolly and another character whom I love, where they discuss poetry and their own work that they've written themselves. So can you say a bit more about poetry in 16th century Wales sort of more broadly and how that fits in with your characterisation of Dolly?
Yes, I can. I think it's quite exposing in a way. I think we all put ourselves in our characters to some extent. And I think as a poet myself, if I'm honest, part of it was just that my prose was very poetic and I was questioned, and a few people said to me, it's too poetic, people don't think like this, and I was like, well, I think like this, what do you mean people don't think like this? And I thought, okay, well, what am I? I'm a poet. So I thought, well, maybe Dolly should be a poet. Why can't she be a poet? And I did worry that it would be inauthentic. And then I met Catherine Chanel White, who is in the room, who is a historian and looks specifically at medieval woman poets, and it turns out they existed. And, like I said, most of history was kind of written and recorded by men. But I think we find the women in the poetry. There's so much poetry by women. And they were writing about so many things. Politics and religion and motherhood and love and grief and friendship. And there's a particular poet, Gwerfyl Mechan, whose works have been translated by Katie Grammich. And her poetry, she's really kind of, I think she was considered kind of a feminist of the early modern period because she wrote about the body. She wrote really kind of satirical poems about the female body. And so I looked at her work and I kind of borrowed from that quite a lot in the novel. And so, Dolly became a poet. And I think that felt really appropriate because I think there's something about poetry and about writing that is kind of akin to witchcraft. It's, it's a spell or it's a blessing. I use poetry to work my way through things, to understand things, to convey what I understand to other people. And so making Dolly a poet felt like I was giving her language and I was giving her power. So it just felt right.
Especially as, what you're saying about sort of giving her power and sort of the voice as well, and sort of, as you're saying earlier, with witchcraft narratives and why there's so many of them at the moment, is that reclamation of voice. And because of her position in society and her marriage, there isn't as much room for her to do that in the world. So his poetry sort of becomes her outlet, and I think it's really nicely woven throughout, where she's struggling with all these various things happening around her, and she goes, poetry. Yeah, this is what I can do. It works really nicely.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. There's a good quote as well by Amber Sparks, where she talks about the temptation to falsely equip women of the past. To give them narratives that just wouldn't have been possible, and it kind of does them a disservice. But there's always something you can give them. Yeah. So, Dolly's a woman. There's only so much power she has, despite being a member of the gentry. She, her power only goes so far, but she has her words. Yeah. That it just felt important to me.
Yeah. My penultimate question, unfortunately, is about the commentaries of the villagers. So you've got, I think it's between every chapter, you have this sort of distant voice almost of the villagers. And I sort of love how it works and sort of how it guides us through. And the villagers act rather like the chorus in ancient Greek tragedies. It's the voice of the people speaking as one, guiding us through the story while offering commentary on the goings-on of, the high-class protagonist. Whether it's accurate or not, that's a whole other thing. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about why you chose to include this voice or voices in the novel.
I think part of it is because this is a first-person story. Without the villagers, we'd only be getting Dolly's perspective. Yeah. And I wanted to add another kind of layer or viewpoint to it. But primarily, the witch trials, and this is kind of everywhere, and we know it was the same in Wales, they really played out on a domestic level, so within villages, within families, within friendships. And there were slander cases, there was accusations, people would accuse their neighbours, they'd accuse their friends, they'd have fallings out and they'd call each other a witch. And it's all kind of really centred on gossip and hearsay, and I wanted the villagers to be able to kind of capture that. And they're contradictory. I wanted them to be contradictory. Yeah. So, they go to Sara Gwen for help. They ask her for help with healing and with finding things and, keeping their cows safe over winter. But when the tides turn against her, they turn against her. Yeah. Because that seems to be the way that it was. Gwen Ellis, who was the first woman hanged, I don't know if I said that earlier, she was the first woman in Wales to be hanged on witchcraft charges. She had friends who encouraged her to run, but she didn't because, well, we don't know why, but maybe she just thought it would never come to anything. Maybe she was proud. But people who had used her services turned against her and spoke out against her publicly and in the courts. And so the villagers are really just a kind of, they encapsulate that.
So it becomes this sort of mix between, so I was saying about the Crucible earlier, sort of the mass hysteria that sort of gets whipped up in sort of the crowds, but also just the way that sort of echo chambers happen and all that sort of stuff, which again is still sort of very relevant today. So one person says, oh, actually, are you sure this is right? Yeah. And sort of come in with this sort of opinion, and then everyone's like, oh, no, they're right. And so, that's sort of the way it sort of builds throughout the novel and sort of becomes almost contradictory with Dolly as well. It's sort of unsettling.
It is unsettling. That feels like quite a good place to read from the villagers, if that's okay.
Please,
We've got a bit of time.
Definitely.
And they're only short sections, so it's an appropriate one to read. Yeah. I tell you what would be a good one, because it's where my page has landed. But it's them kind of being gossipy, effectively. So they've, the villagers are not privy to what's going on in this household necessarily, but people who work in the household, the maids and the servants, may well be carrying stories back and forth. So this kind of comes in after a charm is found in the house. We all heard of it, one way or another. Some folk whispered of it in the alehouse. Some told their husbands over the dinner table, spat out the story like a wishbone. The story was this. The young maid found a curse hidden in the bedchamber up at the big house. There was panic written on the poor master's face. They say the mistress stayed calm, quiet, and we wondered, did she know more than the rest of them? Did she write that curse herself? Things are tense there now, so they say. The servants are afraid to speak out of turn, their wages already made smaller in punishment. The master is determined to find the wicked one, pwy am witchodd. Every day he asks it, who has witched me? the mistress says nothing in return.
So they say.
So they say.
So they say, may not be fact, but...
Yeah, I think the collective voice was important as well, because I did think about having different villagers speaking throughout, but I felt like they needed to be...
cohesive.
Yeah, a collective.
Yeah, it works very well. Was there much in the archives with that sort of groupthink almost, and how that all sort of whipped up, or was there more sort of like individual
cases? But you see, the way things worked was they might have had a kind of an event where they'd have the magistrates go into maybe the local church, and people would come and give their testimonies. So, there could be an element of somebody saying something and then somebody else saying, oh yeah, actually that happened to me too, or, kind of jumping on the bandwagon almost. It feels, and again, that feels very prescient today.
Yes.
So many thoughts.
It's something that, kind of related to that, but sort of much wider really, is, something that we've spoken about quite a lot over the last year or so, is, the importance of trusting the reader and avoiding, the booktokification of narratives, so, relying on a handful of tropes to write and sell a story. One of the many things that I love about Witch is that trust that you put in the reader. So on the one hand, we could quite strongly argue that there is, in fact, quite a clear conclusion to be made about what's going on. But on the other, there is nonetheless a sort of the delightful ambiguity. Could it actually be witchcraft, whatever that might be? So I guess my final question is a two-parter. So how important was that ambiguity to you as a writer in the delivery of this particular narrative? And what is it that you hope your readers will take away from Witch?
I think trusting the reader is really important in fiction. You never want to spoon-feed people or spell anything out. And I think it's really important for people to come to their own conclusions. Because otherwise they're not going to be so strong and they're not going to stick. So yes, ambiguity in a sense, not necessarily around the witchcraft and the magic element of it, but just in terms of having readers be able to draw their own conclusions about, who's right and who's wrong and what their motivations are. That did feel important. What do I want readers to take away? So many things. I think, for me, this is a story about what happens when we don't trust women and their knowledge about their own bodies. And I think it's really... it's difficult because I don't want to kind of lecture, and I do want people to be able to read the novel and make their own kind of decisions or assumptions. But I think what I'm trying to say is, the witch trials aren't something there for titillation. It's not a Halloween costume. It's not, people flock to Salem every year for like tourists, and they've got these garish kind of souvenirs, and and it shouldn't. These were real people. These were real women that were killed. Innocent women that were hanged purely on the grounds of misogyny, effectively. And I think that's one thing that I want people to kind of realise and take away from it. And I think that's part of the rise in the witchture and the witchcraft fiction. And also just that we need to listen to women, because the patriarchal society that we've all existed within so long, it damages everybody. It's not just women; it damages men too. I'm a mother to 2 young boys, and I think that the pressure of that and knowing how detrimental society can be to everybody is really important. And also, I think, although yes, the witch trials were, at least for me and for my understanding, really firmly rooted in misogyny, I think there's also a very important message about what happens when we scapegoat people. And when we don't understand something, and so we cast it as other, and we scapegoat it, and we make it a problem. And I think we're seeing that more and more at the moment. Didn't Nigel Farage recently say that immigrants were trying to eat the swans? This is what happens when we group think and we listen to people who have their own agenda, and we other people instead of actually getting to know them and really understanding them. And I think that's the kind of the central message.
Thank you.